Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to our session today. We have an interactive, and this is the right word, interactive. So yes, please ask your questions. It will be an interactive panel related to data privacy and big data, of course, the topic of our meeting today. Together with me, we have Dimitri. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Dimitri Sirota. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Big ID. We focus on helping organizations get visibility and control of their data. Privacy is one of the primary use cases around data discovery for data rights, and obviously over the course of the panel, I'll talk a little bit more about what we do in privacy.
Lorraine?
My name is Lorraine Waters, and I'm Chief Data Officer for Solidatus. And we are a UK software company specializing in data lineage. Formerly, I was the Chief Data Officer for Global Compliance at HSBC, where I actually bought the software to solve for data privacy and data sharing approvals.
And we have Terry.
Hi, I'm Terry. I'm with a company called Imperva. We do application and data security. I've been with Imperva for about 19 years. I was CTO. I've been in a lot of different roles. Today I'm a fellow and a senior vice president. And here to talk about privacy. Sounds good?
Great. Let me introduce myself as well. My name is Tudor Galus. I'm a privacy consultant working in a boutique company. We have over 150 customers across EU, UK, and the United States. So let's start asking some of questions. Please, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we will address your question, of course. So first one, Dimitri. Many companies are looking at privacy compliance, trying to find one or more silver bullets. How much of the process can be automated when we are talking about data discovery?
Sure. So maybe just to kind of give you kind of my perspective on the kind of state of the world in privacy today. There are two types of solutions, right? You have solutions that I would describe as more workflow or process-based, which is much more focused on helping privacy professionals, typically legal professionals in the privacy office, deal with the generation of privacy impact assessments, record processing activity, things of that sort. And there's a number of vendors in that space. Now, they historically have relied on surveys and questionnaires to get their view into the data. So they build their inventory through questions and through recollections. They're asking people to remember what data do they have where and why. Now there's another set of vendors, of which we're one example, that have said questionnaires and surveys are not enough, right? Privacy, like security, if you want to get effective change and effective transparency in terms of data rights, you need to be able to build your inventory of data by actually looking at the data. So focusing on the data records versus the data recollections. And so when we started building our product about 5 years ago, we believed that you could kind of automate the task of looking across a large data estate. And one thing to remember in privacy regulations is they were written by lawyers. And lawyers don't know the difference between Snowflake and unstructured data and JDBC and HDFS. They don't know what any of that means. So you need to be able to look everywhere. In addition, the privacy regulations, unlike some of the breach regulations, require you to not just look at explicit PII, like credit card information, but also implicit PII. PII that's contextual. PII that is personal because it's connected to a person. Examples could be credentials, like the word password. It could be IP addresses, it could be cookies, it could be GPS coordinates. And then lastly, one of the other distinctions about privacy in terms of building a data inventory and doing data discovery is you're not just trying to find certain types of data, you're also trying to associate that data with an individual, right? Is this data Dimitri's? Is this data Tudor's? And so we developed a technology that allows you to automatically not just discover what kind of data you have across a vast data estate, but also figure out whose data that is. Now it's a hard problem. There is no easy button. We've removed a lot of the scale issues as we've matured, and we're now kind of a unicorn. We've raised $250 million. We have kind of premier financial and retail and communication customers. But part of the aim is to make this extremely automated. Again, we're not quite at the stage where you just press a button and go have a coffee, but it's a lot better than it was 3 years ago.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Lorraine, we talked about mistakes. What are your top, let's say, top 3 recommendation, or let's say even maybe the top 3 key learnings that you had after the mistakes that were made in the past?
I like these kind of questions because they're the kind of questions I want to hear the answer to when I come to a conference as a practitioner. So I'd say the first thing that you need to think about is, never underestimate the amount of time it takes to ingest the data. Whether you're talking about a big data lake or migrating data to the cloud, never underestimate that amount of time. So programs start out and they assume a certain amount of time to get approval to move the data from a certain jurisdiction for a particular purpose, into whatever platform or lake or whatever they're building. It's not that easy. There are GDPR, there's local regulatory regulations. So, to your point, Dimitri, a CDO has got to make friends with the legal representative. They've got to make friends with the reg compliance people to set up a framework to be able to safely and with permission migrate the data into the data lake or to the cloud. And that's mistake number 2. If you don't make friends with those people, it can take months to get data from certain jurisdictions into another jurisdiction or from for certain purposes. And that's another lesson to learn as well. When you are seeking to develop a framework around data sharing and data privacy, be very clear on the use and the purpose for which you're collecting this data. We've probably all seen major programs, for a specific reason, collect vast amount of data, whether it be for regulation or analytics, and they collect it for their own specific purpose. If that's not broad enough, then the very next program is going to have to do the same thing again, and it's just a constant, round and round. Also, if you're starting, if you're not looking at it in an existing state, or even if you are, you must categorize your data, as it goes in. It's so much harder to do that once you've already acquired the data and ingested it. So having, a decent cataloging and tagging, and as you say, automated, ideally, so you keep it fresh and current, is a good thing. And then finally, you need to be able to prove the lineage of the data. You need to have the provenance to see where you sourced it from, what the data is, what purposes and uses you're going to use it for, and where it's actually going. And you need to be able to prove that within your own company for the likes of GDPR, but also for the regulators as well. And this is why I'm a strong advocate of a data lineage, ideally automated data lineage, that you can keep current so you can see the blueprint of data, where you've sourced it, how you're using it, where it's going.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Terry, actually I had a call right this Friday from a guy who told me that some hacker breached their security systems, downloaded their sensitive data, including payroll data and all their employee data, encrypted it and threatened it to publish it on Tor unless paid. So based on this and so many experiences in the past, what are your top 3 security recommendations for a company? Top 3 things every big data company should do.
Okay, so let me be clear. So the data was sensitive. He downloaded it. He encrypted it afterwards. Not what he downloaded, but what you had left. And there's no backups.
No backups.
Okay. So they should have backups. That would be a good start. So I think there's 2 ways to address this. One way to address it is what does he do now? And then there's what should he have done to avoid it? The what should he do now is a really easy one because they don't have backups. So what should he do now is decide whether or not they can continue to provide business continuity without backups and start from scratch with the data, or whether they can. And they need to make sure that that's a secret situation, that they don't have backups and not let anybody know about it. Because if the hacker knows about it, they're in a much deeper situation. There was a organization in the UK that had their backups encrypted as well as everything else taken and encrypted. And I think you can still find them online. It says they're just out of business. I think it's code something or other. They just flat went out of business. But what they could have done to help prevent this type of situation, number one, they really should have been looking at everything, in my opinion. So, and I see this all the time in organizations, is they silo what they tend to do from a security monitoring perspective. Consider network security, and I mentioned this in the presentation earlier, but consider network security. You monitor everything in your network, right? Nothing goes through your network that doesn't go through a network firewall. It always does, you see it all. But we do something very different in data security. We monitor just what's important to me, maybe what's just regulated, or that's a really important core banking server, so I'll monitor that. Take healthcare, maybe I monitor my electronic medical record system, maybe I don't, maybe it doesn't support it. Point is we only monitor very specific things. If you do that, it implies that you're not monitoring everything else, and that's fairly typical in a lot of organizations. So a lot of the banks that I work with will provide security monitoring for 5 to 20% of their overall infrastructure and ignore the other 80% of the infrastructure. It's just not monitored, it's not there. Dev and test, not monitored. Is there production data in dev and test? Sure, there is, but it's not monitored. So as a hacker, I know that I've got a lot of places to go where I'm likely not going to be seen. And it goes faster from this. The big factor is it's not just about monitoring all of that, it's about being able to monitor wherever you go. So this is big data, right? A lot of big data is in the cloud. A lot of it you've moved and modernized. You've got to have solutions that are out there that not just support on-prem, but support the cloud. And the reverse is true. You can't just go into a solution that just supports your big data platform in the cloud and forget about your mainframe, your AS400, and your old systems, and assume that those don't matter anymore. They do, they're just as important. And lastly, I would say, and Dimitri talked about this, is automation. I don't know any of your security teams, but I will tell you, more than 90% of your security teams don't know data security. And the way I'll prove it to you is go to LinkedIn and type in data security in quotes, and you'll get 100,000 people that say they know it. Not do know it, but say they know it. Type in database security and you get 30,000 people in the world that claim to know anything about database security. And most of them probably work for us, maybe Dimitri or a couple of other people. But the point is you're just not going to find them. So automation is critical when it comes to being able to do this. Your security team isn't going to be able to tell you that that user shouldn't touch that data and that user shouldn't touch that data and this app shouldn't touch that. Automation will tell you those users don't touch that data, except today they did, and that's an incident for you.
Thank you very much. Going back to Dimitri, a friend of mine called me a few months ago, actually, speaking of automation, and told me that in their test system, they tested a new feature. It was an e-commerce website. So he actually tested an order. The problem is that he did this on the test environment, but the second day the courier dispatched the parcel to his home. So basically the question is, how do you make sure as a company that your data governance initiative is actually working and things like this do not happen, like data from test environment going to production?
Yeah, sure. So look, here's the challenge with governance in general, whether it's about data, network, whatever you want to govern. A lot of the systems are predicated on building rules and identifying exceptions to the rules. The problem with rules is how do you enforce those rules? How do you stop people doing bad things? How do you detect people doing bad things? How do you deal with shadow data or shadow servers and all this kind of other thing? So rules, it's one thing to have rules and definitions of allowed behavior, but if somebody instruments their own kind of data source for test data or for quality control or for some BI process, there's always a way of getting around the rules. So my belief is that there's a couple things that are required in order to catch these corner cases, and it's always the corner cases that get you into trouble. One is you have to have kind of a situational awareness around all your data, right? How do you detect and understand that somebody didn't create some ephemeral kind of data set for BI, or create a copy of some data for test, or just spin up some other data sources in AWS or Azure? And so part of the challenge of traditional kind of data governance is they didn't have that situational awareness. They weren't looking everywhere. They weren't able to detect that new systems were in place, or frankly, existing systems had changed. They presumed this kind of more passive, Pacific kind of environment, which of course is not the reality of today's Snowflake or Redshift. Today data is constantly in flux, it's changing, tables are changing, schemas are changing, new servers are getting built up. So one thing is understanding that kind of situation around what is my data landscape and how is it evolving or changing to be able to make those rules relevant. The other thing that's missing is you could have rules, but then what? What happens if there's an exception? How do you instrument an action? So Gartner is now kind of talking about this notion of active metadata, this idea of being able to perform an action based on a particular situation, almost event driven. And so the other thing that you're seeing in a shift, and we're one of the companies that talk about this, is not only this ability to detect change, to have a more comprehensive situational awareness, but also to be able to identify a violation and be able to perform either a notification or even invoke some other kind of application to remediate, right? Call another type of capability and let the security personnel know so they could remediate. And the remediation could be de-identification, it could be deletion, it could be any number of things. But again, providing that full cycle, beyond just setting up some rules and only looking at a couple of 4 or 5 data sources, you need to look across everything, you need to be responsive to change, and then you need to create this kind of pipelining so that you could detect change and action a response to that change to do governance effectively.
And if I can sort of pipe in there a little bit as well, in the talk that we had before this, the lady who was speaking, started to talk about the data culture. And certainly for data privacy, you need to embed data privacy at the design stage, so by design and by default. So you need to educate, the organization on what that means. Not just the data professionals or the data privacy professionals, but the developers and the change professionals as well. And to your point, Dimitri, when you talk about a rules-based environment and you talk about detecting where you have anomalies or issues, at Solidatus and amongst our community of users, what we're trying to do is sort of turn that around. So instead of detect and react, much more proactively prevent the issues that you talk about. So by creating a lineage first, you can, manage dynamically how the data is flowing through your organization and, federate out tasks to the teams and the SMEs and the systems to tell you when change happens so that you can maintain that blueprint of your data and, again, as I said, model the impact of any change as well, but also keep a version of what happened when so that you can understand the root causes of it, when the inevitable post-mortem happens, in your organization.
Thank you very much. Back to Lorraine now.
Oh.
Now, multinational companies have data spread across different geographies. Many of them have its own privacy regulations, plus other impactful regulations such as anti-money laundering or financial or human resources and so on. How to tackle different lifetime requirements, security requirements, privacy notifications, data subject rights, especially when we are talking about data lineage and actually detecting which data is coming from and it's subject to which regulation, especially, as you said, due to the fact that regulations change so often.
Well, the simple answer, as we talked about earlier, is to automate. So you need to have automated data lineage that is capable of mapping to the external regulation and legislation. So as they change, and we see data privacy regulations changing all the time. In previous roles, I was looking across 62, 64 jurisdictions, and even in the last few years, more and more data privacy legislation is springing up. GDPR-like, but also some very, specific nationalistic type regulations where a government might not like the fact that certain tech companies can see more of their citizens' data than they can. So, every country will have their own data privacy legislation, and you need to be able to monitor that, and as it changes, understand the impact on your systems, your data, your policies, the roles that can use and see the data, and and how you sort of monitor that going forward. I think it took something like 18 months in a previous organization for us to just discover where the PII data was, let alone how we were going to move into compliance with DPIAs and DSARs, etc. And that's not uncommon. I see that across so many financial services firms, and they are typically ahead of the curve on these things and have the money to invest in the controls. So I'm sure it's an even bigger struggle for non-financial services firms. So data privacy by design, by default, and build your data lineage first. Detecting and reacting is just a zero-sum game.
Thank you very much. First, I'll ask now the public, how many of you exchange data on WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and so on? Business conversations. Many of these business conversations contain personal data. Terry, how do we secure this? How do we make sure that such data transfers, in fact, data processing operations are compliant and secure?
If you're talking specifically about WhatsApp, the answer would be don't use it, but I use it, it's fine. When I think about how do you secure that type of an attack, that kind of attack is typically what I would consider a reasonably modern attack. You would need to attack WhatsApp to really be able to get that data. You could almost call it supply chain, but I won't go to supply chain. When I think about trying to protect modern things, the reality is hackers going after data that you're sending over WhatsApp is not going to be a high volume attack. That's going to be a very pointed attack. But I think more importantly, that'd be a new strategy, if you will. And hackers are like water. They're going to take the path of least resistance, just like employees will if you put too much restrictions on them. So when you think about the path of least resistance, trying to solve that kind of problem for many organizations I work with goes away from trying to solve every problem and instead works its way toward acceptable risk. You're not going to close every gap. You're going to have gaps. You're going to have problems. And if you try to solve everything, you're never going to be done, and you're always going to be behind the ball anyway. And you're going to go well outside your budget. So to stay within budget and stay within where you're trying to do, acceptable risk is what I see. And I'll give you an example. There's a healthcare organization in the United States, Anthem Healthcare. They lost 80 million records 5 or 6 years ago or something. When we went in and spoke to them, they said, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And I said, well, all the things I talked about earlier, monitor all your data, collect everything, all that. And they said, all right, well, what kind of rules should we put in place? You talked about rules, right? Access. How do you identify what these rules are and how you're going to put them in? I said, forget all that. I said, one rule is all you need. What is your acceptable amount of loss on data? The answer could be 0, that's fine, and there's a lot more rules we need to create for that. But if the answer is, well, I could lose 500 records or 1,000 records or 2,000 records, my people could still do their jobs, I could do this, and I could triage that pretty easily and it wouldn't be that impactful to the organization. Whatever that number is, I told them, I said, look, you just lost 80 million records. Let's start with 1 million records. Let anybody in your organization that's authorized to access 1 million records. And in a month, if nobody's violated that, let's lower it by half and lower it by half and lower it by half. And we got down to about 50,000 records. So nobody in the company needed access to 50,000 records. So from a security perspective, I could not impact their business in any way, yet still minimize their overall risk drastically by having one policy in place that just simply said nobody can touch 50,000 records. And we can put a workflow, you talk about workflows and automation. We can put something like that in and say if somebody needs to, there's a way to do it, but that's how we do it. So ultimately, my point here is when you try to do that sort of stuff, when you're trying to minimize modern types of attacks and you don't know what's coming next, then focus on the data itself and not the avenue, and try to minimize the big batches of data where you can lose them. The onesies and twosies type of data are going to be bad and it's going to get you a news article or something, but you don't want to be the 80 million record, the 50 million, the 100 million record company. That's when you get really impacted.
Thank you very much. Dimitri, taking into consideration this example with WhatsApp, usually all these means of non-standard communication, they produce quite large amounts of data which are siloed data in the end. How do we actually categorize this data? How do we integrate it in our discovery efforts, and what do we do with them once we discover them?
Yeah, sure. So when we kind of entered the space kind of around 2017, most of the discovery technologies were focused on a small set of data. So you had technologies like Varonis focused on file shares, you had technologies like Imperva focused on structured data, you had other technologies focused, DLP technologies focused on email, and there was kind of a world of technologies focused on different types of data. Privacy kind of changed the game a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the regulators don't know the difference between structured and unstructured images, data in motion. They don't know what any of that means. And so it was important to be able to provide that kind of single lens across that universe of data that you have, whether it's in the cloud, on premise, in motion, at rest, structured or unstructured. And so what we embarked on is essentially kind of trying to abstract out the details of how you connect to the data, how you kind of understand the data, and still make it available within kind of a broader kind of data analysis, data intelligent layer. So we separated out the kind of abstraction layer, almost creating this kind of mesh-like environment that could look across hundreds of different data types, from mainframe and vSAM and DB2 to like Slack and Teams and Salesforce and Workday and AWS and Snowflake and Databricks. And that was the first step. So in our kind of reimagined platform, we've abstracted out how you connect to all these various data frameworks, whether they're in motion, whether they're messaging and communication, whatever they are. We've abstracted away kind of how you analyze the data, whether you're analyzing it for privacy, security, or data governance, and then how you perform an action on that data, whether it's for privacy, security, or data governance. And so again, we kind of re-architected the story, but the main innovation we did is we said, look, we got to break the silos. We can't have different technologies focused on different data types. Nobody cares. You can't solve privacy that way. You need to be able to find PII or your crown jewels wherever it is, and so you need to be able to find an easier way to look across everything.
I think absolutely right, and that plays to the point that I mentioned earlier about, it's absolutely necessary to catalog your data.
Terry, now when we've discussed this also in the previous sessions, anonymization. Is actually data anonymization possible to do a full anonymization, or is especially taking into consideration how AI and machine learning and deep learning algorithms are evolving? Isn't that quite, I don't know, a wishful thinking that anonymization will still be possible in the future, that no algorithm will be available to actually de-anonymize the data back and make it personal data again? What do you think on this?
So today's technology can do it. I mean, it's certainly out there. I think it depends on what your ultimate goal and use case really is for anonymization. You could argue, encryption to a degree would be that, but when I think of data anonymization, I think of transformation, right? Transforming data from one form to the other, and as you said, de-transforming that. Certainly, back to the encryption piece, yes, I can encrypt something, I can send it to the other side, and there are plenty of keys out there to be able to decrypt that. But if I'm talking about changing Terry to Tom and then sending that across and somebody else figure out that it's actually Terry on the other side, there's always been these two different pathways, right? Static anonymization, or static masking, if you will, and dynamic masking. For years, I've had people ask about dynamic masking, and it's possible, it can definitely be done. It requires a lot of configuration and a lot of awareness about the type of data you have and how it's going to be used, to the degree that a simple mistake, if you're doing it in a production environment, can drastically impact where you're putting that data and overwrite critical data. So my point is while it's possible, the impact of a misconfiguration of it is quite significant, such that you may have to revert to a backup. So I don't see dynamic anonymization being used very much today. Static anonymization makes a ton of sense. I think you should use it to take databases out of scope. I'll admit, we used to have a product on it. We didn't sell much of it. We deprecated it. We don't do it anymore. But it makes a ton of sense in that if you've got 1,000 databases, we do structured data, 1,000 databases, if 500 of them are dev and test and using production data but don't actually need production data, then don't put production data in there. Transform that data into production-like data, and then they're out of scope for security. They don't matter. They're not part of privacy. They're not part of the other elements, and they don't need to be scanned. But if you've got production data in there, then you've got an issue. So static anonymization, I think, makes a ton of sense. Dynamic can be done. I just think it's a bit dangerous, and you just have to be eyes on and watching it very carefully.
Thank you very much. Lorraine, you worked a lot in banking and financial services. How should a financial services institution or a company which serves a bank or even a bank, how should they treat different new regulations which appear, especially nowadays that transparency is required, laws like anti-money laundering and other specifications? How should they incorporate in their data governance strategy so that still they are not processing excessive amount of data, but at the same time respecting all the new regulations that appear?
Well, to Terry's point about static anonymization, as a CDO, you have to balance wanting to give as much access to the data as possible for the right uses and purposes for analytics or whatever, versus managing the rights of the individual and the data privacy legislation that you have. So I'm a big fan of anonymization of the data and accessibility of the data, making it available to the communities that they need it. In terms of new regulations coming on board, particularly around AML, financial crime in general, for those purposes, you're allowed to do a lot more and collect a lot more and retain a lot more of the data. And that's back to my point, when you are setting out your request to access to data, make it broad so it can cover that, but other use cases as well. But put in place safeguards like what users can and can't see the data for whatever purposes. So, I think how we currently monitor transactions and report on transactions for AML purposes is extremely old-fashioned, extremely cumbersome. You have to look at every single transaction. You have to set out scenarios to try and figure out and try and keep one step ahead of the bad guys. Whereas if we use more advanced analytics, rather than looking at every single transaction, every single individual, we would be able, we are able to detect much more potential cases of financial crime or fraud. So it is called an intelligence-led approach. So much more like the intelligence communities would use data and assess data rather than the current transaction monitoring and sanction screening approaches that the financial services teams are using.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the public? Now is the time to ask. Yeah, we have there one.
Hello.
Just a second.
Hello.
Hello.
I have more of a general question. There's a lot of hype about blockchain technologies and how it will sort of transform how we use data, but more importantly, how it will secure data. Can you just talk a little about that in terms of that regard, in terms of security of data using blockchain technology?
Who wants to take it?
I could, I'm sure we all want to take it, but I'll maybe kind of speak to it. So, look, I think there's been a lot of talk about using blockchain, but I think there also needs to be kind of a fit for purpose. Obviously, blockchain does introduce certain decentralized ways of managing contracts, but there's probably more innovation in terms of, we were just talking about different approaches to masking, dynamic masking. I would say if you want to focus on either building data sets for BI, there's better approaches around synthetic data, maybe homomorphic data. If you want to do multi-party compute for doing kind of data sharing and collaboration, there's a whole host of technologies, and they don't necessarily have to be blockchain specific. But again, I think there's a lot of innovation around how do you deal with, how do you de-identify data, or at least anonymize data or pseudonymize the data. And again, I think blockchain has some promises in terms of sharing data and building the contracts for the data, but not necessarily the technology that you're going to use to de-identify the data.
That's fine.
Ooh, is this on? Oh, yeah. Question for a practical question for Terry, if I'm here in the middle.
Oh, there you are. Thanks.
I really like your suggestion around security of having a global limit on how many records someone can access. How do you practically do that?
So I want to make sure I understand the question because it's a little hard to hear. You like
He wants
the
to know how he buys an Imperva gateway.
So I guess if you've got multiple systems and people are accessing data in a whole different ways across your whole organization, how do you effectively prevent people accessing more than a certain number of records in one go?
All right, so it comes down to one of the things we talked about at the very beginning, or from I think the first question that you'd asked, where you'd asked about the person that had gotten breached. And I said, look, you really need to be monitoring everything. There's too many gaps within the organization where you can't monitor everybody. I think traditionally in data security, the expectation was it was complex and there wasn't enough scale to really monitor everything. So you had to be very selective about who you were going to monitor. Most people relegated themselves to, I'm going to monitor the DBAs because they have access to everything. That's why I'll monitor, but I'll ignore the apps and I'll ignore maybe other users. Technology has come a long way since the early 2000s when that was traditional DAM, to where today organizations, data security organizations, can easily consume petabytes of data over multiple days. So it's easy to monitor that data and you don't have to store it and archive it and take it off. So long story short is you should be able to monitor all of those people. Because you're monitoring them within the SQL language itself naturally, I can see what number of records are coming back from whatever SQL query happens to be. Select star from whatever, right? I'm getting a volume of data back. When I get that volume of data back, I have my number. What makes it different is the other point that I think almost all of us have talked about, which is automation. It is impossible, in my opinion, to just build a set of rules that says, well, that person can get 5 records and that person can get 10. You're never going to get to anything that makes sense. But analytics, as everybody uses today, analytics does let us model individual users and entities, and I can say, I got Terry, and Terry normally operates in these ways in these databases. He doesn't touch these databases at all. When Terry's volume goes beyond what his normal volume is, what his peers' normal volume are, et cetera, then I can start to find outliers in that, and I can determine whether he should be touching that data in the first place at that volume, at that veracity, or whatever. So that's typically the way we're seeing it today, is the model of data security moving from a very static, this is what people can do, to a more malleable, this is what people normally do, this is how their peers do, clustering, peering, et cetera, standard machine learning stuff, but also comparing that to the applications, which I think people ignored in the past, and is a very strong data point for being able to determine whether somebody is doing something good or bad.
Okay, closure. I would like a closure sentence from each one of you.
Sure, so I'll be quick. So I think part of the theme here today was really kind of focusing on the data for privacy, that if you want to truly protect privacy and provide trust and transparency, you need to start with the data and not decouple it and have kind of something that's kind of more in the ether.
I would agree with that, and as I mentioned, what I found most powerful when trying to protect data privacy was starting with a lineage-first approach, a proactive, preventive way, ensuring that data privacy was built in to my controls at the design stage. And Solidators is on stand 330 if you want to come and talk about that.
They're giving us the X sign, so what I'm going to say is, monitor it all, you absolutely can, because if you can't see it, you can't protect it. It's that simple. If you're not looking at it, you're going to lose it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending this session. Add us on LinkedIn, search us on social media. Let's keep on the conversation going. Thank you very much. Have a great conference.
Thank you.